The most dangerous moment in any awakening is not when you finally see through the illusions that have held you captive for decades. It is not when you recognize that most of what you believed about success, happiness, and belonging was carefully constructed mythology designed to keep you asleep. The most dangerous moment is when you realize that you can never again pretend to find fulfillment in the conversations, relationships, and pursuits that once defined your entire sense of self, and you must face the terrifying recognition that this awakening has made you, in the eyes of those you love most, fundamentally different and irreversibly alone. This is not bitterness speaking, nor the cynical voice of someone who has given up on human connection and retreated into intellectual superiority. This is the voice of the soul beginning to stir from its ancient slumber, and like all genuine awakenings, it comes with the sharp recognition of how deeply we have been participating in collective unconsciousness without ever questioning whether there might be another way to live. Joseph Campbell spent his entire life studying this precise moment across every culture and mythology known to human civilization, and what he discovered will change everything you thought you knew about why you feel so different, so alone, and so impossibly drawn towards something you cannot yet name. You know this moment intimately, though you may never have recognized its mythic significance or understood that your personal experience of alienation is actually the first sacred step of the hero's journey that Campbell mapped across 1,000 different stories and 1,000 different cultures. It arrives when you sit among friends, family, or colleagues and suddenly realize that the conversations swirling around you feel like performances in a play you no longer wish to attend, where everyone has memorized their lines about weekend plans, career achievements, social media updates, and the endless circulation of opinions about people who will never know their names, and all of it begins to feel like elaborate rituals performed by sleepwalkers who have mistaken the dream for reality. The awakening soul begins to notice the mechanical nature of daily existence, how conversations follow predictable patterns, like scripts written by some invisible playwright, how relationships often function more like social contracts than genuine connections, how the pursuit of status, security, and approval creates an endless cycle that promises fulfillment, but delivers only the need for more pursuit, more validation, more proof that we exist and matter in a universe that seems increasingly indifferent to our carefully constructed identities. This is not a judgment of others, for the awakening hero understands that they too participated fully in these same patterns until something within them began to stir and question whether there might be deeper currents of meaning that most people, perhaps by necessity or design, have learned to ignore or suppress. But here lies the sacred paradox that Campbell identified in myth after myth, across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. The very awareness that initially separates the awakening hero from their community is also precisely what qualifies them to eventually serve that community in ways they never could have imagined, while still asleep within the collective trance. The solitude that feels like punishment is actually preparation. The disconnection that seems like failure is actually the first step toward a kind of connection that transcends the superficial bonds of shared unconsciousness and reaches toward something Campbell recognized as the fundamental unity that underlies all authentic human relationship. The hero's initial response to this awakening is often what Campbell termed the refusal of the call, and it manifests as a desperate attempt to return to the warm comfort of belonging, even when that belonging has begun to feel hollow and performative. Who would willingly choose the uncertain path of inner exploration over the familiar comfort of playing roles that others understand and approve of participating in conversations that require no depth or vulnerability, of pursuing goals that society has pre-approved as meaningful and worthwhile? The refusal is not only natural, but perhaps even necessary, because the journey inward requires leaving behind the external validation that has shaped identity and self-worth for so long, and most souls need time to gather courage for such a fundamental departure from everything they have ever known about how to be human in the world. Yet the call persists with a quality that Campbell recognized as fundamentally different from ordinary desires or ambitions, manifesting not as something we want, but as something that wants us, not as a goal to achieve, but as a recognition of who we have always been beneath the accumulated layers of social conditioning and inherited expectations. It arrives as restlessness that cannot be satisfied by any external change of circumstance, as questions that disturb the peace of assumed answers, as a growing inability to engage wholeheartedly in pursuits that once felt meaningful and necessary, but now seem like elaborate distractions from the real work of understanding what it means to be fully alive and authentic in a world that seems designed to reward conformity and discourage genuine self-discovery. The soul that has begun to awaken cannot return to unconscious participation in the collective dream, no matter how desperately it might wish to do so, because once you have seen beyond the veil of social conditioning, the veil becomes increasingly transparent and impossible to ignore. This is both the burden and the gift of heightened awareness, the double-edged sword that Campbell observed in every mythic tradition. The hero who answers the call to adventure must leave behind the safety and comfort of the known world and venture into territories that cannot be mapped by ordinary consciousness or navigated using the skills and strategies that worked perfectly well in the realm of collective unconsciousness. Campbell recognized that this initial solitude serves a profound purpose in the mythic structure of transformation, functioning as what he called a threshold guardian that tests the hero's readiness for the journey ahead and separates those who are merely curious about awakening from those who are truly prepared to sacrifice everything they thought they knew about themselves in service of discovering who they really are. Those who cannot bear the loneliness of seeing differently, who find the isolation of authentic awareness too painful to endure, will naturally find ways to numb their perception, to rejoin the collective trance through distraction, substance, spiritual bypassing, or simply the willful suppression of their deeper knowing in favor of comfortable unconsciousness. But those who can sit with the solitude, who can resist the urge to immediately fill the empty space with new distractions or premature attempts at connection, who can allow themselves to be present with the fertile void that Campbell recognized as the creative space from which genuine transformation emerges, discover that this apparent emptiness is actually full of possibility, pregnant with potentials that could never have been conceived while still operating from the limited perspective of socially conditioned identity. The threshold between the ordinary world of collective unconsciousness and the special world of individual awakening is not a geographical boundary that can be crossed through external action, but a psychological passage that every awakening soul must traverse alone, without guides or maps or guarantees of safe return. This is where the hero's journey becomes profoundly interior, where the special world reveals itself not as a distant kingdom or magical realm, but as the landscape of consciousness itself, with all its hidden territories of fear, desire, conditioning, shadow, and the authentic self-knowledge that lies buried beneath decades of accumulated beliefs about who we are supposed to be and how we are supposed to live. To enter this realm requires crossing through what Campbell described as the belly of the whale, a symbolic death of the old identity, and a willingness to be digested, transformed, and eventually reborn as someone who can no longer pretend to find fulfillment in the very things that once seemed essential to happiness and meaning. The solitude intensifies here, because the language of transformation has no easy translation in the ordinary world of conventional relationships and socially acceptable conversation. How do you explain to someone who has never questioned their fundamental assumptions that you are beginning to see those assumptions as constructs rather than truths, as inherited programs rather than natural responses, as collective agreements rather than inevitable realities? How do you describe the process of dismantling the very foundation of identity without sounding like you are losing your mind or rejecting everything that others hold sacred about human existence and social connection? If you recognize yourself in this ancient pattern of awakening, if you feel the stirring of your own call to adventure, or find yourself already navigating the initial stages of this interior journey, I want you to know that you are not alone in your solitude, and you are not broken or antisocial for finding conventional life increasingly hollow and unsatisfying. You are part of an invisible community of souls who understand that the most important adventures happen not in the outer world of achievement and acquisition, but in the vast and mysterious landscape of consciousness itself. Share your own moments of recognition in the comments below. Subscribe to join this circle of fellow travelers, and let us create a space where the language of authentic transformation can be spoken and understood without apology or explanation. As the journey deepens beyond the initial call and refusal, the awakening hero encounters what Campbell identified as the approach to the inmost cave. That psychological territory, where the deepest fears and the most authentic treasures of the soul reside side by side, inseparable and equally necessary for the completion of the transformative process that no external teacher or system can accomplish on our behalf. This phase intensifies the solitude in ways that can feel almost unbearable, yet it is precisely here that the most profound gifts of the heroic path begin to reveal themselves, not as rewards for good behavior or spiritual achievement, but as natural consequences of the courage to face what we have spent a lifetime avoiding, and to embrace what we have been taught to reject about our own deepest nature. The inmost cave manifests differently for each individual consciousness, but its essential character remains consistent across all awakening journeys throughout history and across cultures. It is the place where the hero must confront not only their personal shadows and unhealed wounds, but the collective shadows of their entire culture, their family lineage, their historical moment, and ultimately, the human condition itself. This confrontation cannot be shared with others, or delegated to experts or accomplished through any external method or technique, because it is the ultimate trial that each consciousness must undergo in the solitude of their own direct experience, without intermediaries or interpreters or anyone who can take their place in the facing of what must be faced. In this phase, the solitude transforms from mere separation into something Campbell recognized as sacred isolation, where the hero begins to understand that their withdrawal from conventional social engagement is not antisocial or selfish, but deeply pro-social in the truest sense, because it represents the necessary retreat that allows them to return to community with something genuinely valuable to offer, rather than simply adding their voice to the chorus of collective unconsciousness. The hero realizes that they must temporarily step outside the shared trance in order to develop the clarity and strength necessary to serve the awakening of consciousness itself, both in their own soul and in the larger human community. Yet this natural phase of development is often pathologized or misunderstood in contemporary culture, where the hero who needs solitude for inner work is labeled antisocial or depressed, where the hero who questions fundamental cultural assumptions is deemed negative or difficult, where the hero who cannot participate wholeheartedly in superficial social rituals is considered problematic or mentally ill. This cultural misunderstanding adds another layer of trial to the journey, requiring the hero to maintain faith in the process even when surrounded by voices that suggest something is fundamentally wrong with them for being unable to find satisfaction in the very things that seem to satisfy everyone else. But within this deepened solitude, something extraordinary begins to happen that Campbell observed in mythic traditions across the world. The hero discovers that authenticity, even when it leads to temporary isolation from conventional community, creates the possibility for connections of unprecedented depth and meaning with other souls who are walking similar paths of awakening. These connections, rare as they are, possess a quality that the hero never experienced in relationships based on shared unconsciousness, social roles, or mutual entertainment, because they are founded on mutual recognition of each person's deepest truth rather than their carefully constructed social persona. Campbell called these encounters sacred marriage, not necessarily romantic partnership, but any relationship founded on seeing and being seen, accepting and being accepted, loving and being loved for who we actually are, rather than who we pretend to be or think we should be. Such relationships might emerge with other travelers on the path of conscious awakening, with mentors who have completed their own hero's journey and returned with wisdom to share, with creative collaborators who share the hero's vision of what human life could become, or sometimes with individuals who, while not necessarily awakening themselves, possess the rare wisdom to recognize and honor the hero's process without trying to talk them out of it or convince them to return to conventional ways of being. The rarity of these authentic connections makes them precious beyond measure, teaching the hero to distinguish between the loneliness of exile and the solitude of preparation, between the isolation that comes from hiding one's truth and the selective sharing that comes from honoring one's truth. This discernment becomes one of the hero's most valuable skills because it allows them to move between worlds without being trapped by either one, engaging with ordinary reality when necessary without losing their hard-won perspective, and retreating into solitary reflection without becoming lost in self-absorption or spiritual bypassing. My friend, if you have found yourself in this phase of the journey, if you recognize the particular challenges and gifts of approaching your own inmost cave, know that your willingness to face what others prefer to avoid is not just personal healing, but service to the awakening of consciousness itself. Your courage to question what others accept without examination, to seek authenticity, even when it costs you easy belonging, is exactly what our world needs in these times of collective transformation. Please subscribe and share your insights below, because your voice matters in this ancient conversation about what it means to be fully human. The hero's return to the ordinary world marks not the end of solitude, but its transformation into something Campbell recognized as essential to human flourishing. The capacity to maintain inner stillness while fully engaging with the complexity of life, to be simultaneously alone and connected, to participate without attachment, to serve without losing oneself in the service. This return, which Campbell identified as the most difficult stage of the entire journey, requires the hero to integrate their hard-won wisdom with the practical demands of living in a world that has not undergone the same transformation, and to find ways of sharing their gifts that honor both the depth of their experience and the readiness of others to receive what they have discovered. The solitude that began as exile and deepened into sacred preparation now reveals its ultimate purpose as a portable sanctuary, an inner space of clarity and peace that the hero can access regardless of external circumstances or the consciousness level of those around them. They learn to carry their awakening not as a burden that separates them from others, but as a gift that allows them to meet each person exactly where they are, while maintaining their own center, their own truth, their own connection to the deeper currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of conventional reality. This integration presents unique challenges because the returned hero cannot simply resume their old role in the collective unconsciousness, playing the same games and pursuing the same goals that once seemed so important, yet neither can they remain permanently withdrawn from social engagement, isolated in their hard-won wisdom, while the world continues to suffer from the very unconsciousness they have transcended in themselves. Campbell observed that the most effective returning heroes develop what he called skillful means, the ability to communicate transformational wisdom in forms that can be received and utilized by others at various stages of their own awakening process. The mastery of skillful means often requires the hero to become multilingual in the truest sense, fluent in both the language of awakened consciousness and the language of conventional reality, able to speak of practical matters with those concerned with practical matters, to engage in social pleasantries with those who need social connection, to discuss philosophy with those drawn to philosophical inquiry, and to share silence with those ready for the deepest teachings. This flexibility is not compromise or deception, but compassion in action, meeting others where they are rather than demanding they meet the hero where the hero has arrived through their own unique journey of transformation. The returned hero discovers that their greatest service often comes not through preaching or teaching in conventional ways, but through embodying a quality of presence that others find mysteriously attractive without being able to name exactly what has changed. People may not understand what is different about the hero, but they sense something that draws them, a kind of aliveness, authenticity, peace or freedom that demonstrates through lived example that it is possible to live with greater joy, deeper connection, and more genuine meaning than most people imagine possible within the constraints of ordinary human existence. This embodied teaching requires the hero to maintain their inner solitude, even in the midst of social engagement, learning to be alone with others and together while alone, to participate fully while remaining inwardly spacious, to care deeply without attachment to outcomes. Campbell noted that this paradoxical capacity characterizes all true masters throughout history. They are simultaneously deeply connected to others and completely free from dependence on others for their sense of identity, worth, or happiness. The hero's relationship to solitude thus evolves from something they endure to something they cultivate, recognizing solitude not as the absence of connection, but as the foundation for authentic connection, not as isolation from life, but as intimate communion with the source of life itself. Their time alone becomes a source of renewal, insight, and preparation for more skillful engagement with the world, while their engagement with others becomes an expression of the love and wisdom they have discovered in solitude. Perhaps most importantly, the returned hero understands that their journey is never truly complete, that each level of awakening reveals new possibilities for growth, service, and understanding. The solitude that once felt like punishment has become an ongoing relationship with the depths of consciousness, a regular return to the source that keeps their wisdom fresh and their service authentic. They embrace what Campbell called the freedom to live, the capacity to respond spontaneously and appropriately to whatever life presents, unencumbered by the need to maintain a fixed identity or to meet external expectations about how an awakened person should behave. For those who recognize themselves in this ancient pattern, remember that your journey serves not only your own liberation, but the liberation of human consciousness itself. Every soul who completes the hero's journey makes it easier for others to begin their own. Your courage to walk this path becomes part of the invisible network of light that guides others home to themselves.